The sky was dark and heavy with smoke, the sound of explosions echoing through the air. The planet below had turned into a battlefield, a wasteland of destruction. The once thriving colony was now nothing more than ashes, and amidst the chaos, a lone figure staggered through the debris. She was bloodied, bruised, and barely conscious, but she kept moving. The half-human, half-alien princess was on the run, left behind by the very people who once swore to protect her. Her enemies, the alien factions that had once supported her, had now turned on her. They had betrayed her, leaving her to die on this forsaken planet. Her hybrid nature made her different from the others. She was a symbol of peace, a bridge between two cultures, half alien and half human. But now, that same uniqueness had become her curse. Her people feared what she represented, and the leaders of her own faction had decided she was too dangerous to live. They had seen her as a threat, a challenge to their power, and so they abandoned her to die at the hands of her enemies. She stumbled through the rocky landscape, her breathing heavy, the pain from her wounds clouding her mind. The planet was cold, the harsh wind biting into her skin, but it was nothing compared to the betrayal that had cut deep into her heart. Her world was crashing down around her, and she had no one to trust. Her mind wandered back to the moments before the attack. She had been in the heart of a council meeting, trying to broker peace between the warring alien factions. It was supposed to be a moment of hope, but it turned into a nightmare. She had been ambushed, surrounded by enemies, and with no way to escape. Her allies had turned their backs on her. The betrayal had been swift and cold, and now she was left to die alone. She collapsed onto the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion, her vision blurred, and she felt the darkness creeping in. The sounds of footsteps reached her ears, but they weren't the footsteps of her enemies. These steps were different, distant, deliberate, and they didn't sound threatening. She forced herself to lift her head, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of hope. But what she saw next nearly made her heart stop. A human soldier, clad in a standard combat suit, appeared in the distance. His figure was tall, and he moved with the confident, steady steps of someone who had seen battle. He was alone, and as he approached, the princess's first instinct was to panic. Humans were not her allies. They had always been enemies, caught in the middle of the war between the alien factions. She had heard stories of humans being ruthless, of them waging war across the galaxy without mercy. But there was something about this soldier that made her pause. His movements were cautious, almost as if he were aware of the dangers around him. He knelt down beside her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He studied her carefully, his face set in a look of determination, but his eyes softened with empathy. The princess could feel the warmth of his presence, and for a fleeting moment, she almost forgot the pain. "You're not alone," he finally said, his voice low but steady. "I won't let you die here." The princess tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Why? I'm nothing but a failure, a pawn in a game I can't even understand." The soldier didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a medical kit. He worked quickly, his movements precise, as he began to treat her wounds. She flinched at the touch, but there was something in the way he handled her that made her trust him, just for a moment. The princess wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave her and save himself, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the hopelessness she felt. After all, what was the point of fighting anymore? Her people had abandoned her. Her fate had already been sealed. But this soldier, this human, was different. He didn't seem to care about the politics, the alliances, or the wars. He simply saw a wounded person in need of help, and he acted. His compassion, so unexpected from someone she had been taught to hate, stirred something inside her. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. "You're not going to leave me here?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Not a chance," he replied firmly, finishing the final touches of her treatment. "I'm not the kind of person who leaves people to die. Not on my watch." As he helped her to sit up, The princess realized just how much strength she had left, both physical and emotional. This human had given her something she hadn't felt in a long time, a reason to keep going. The cold, harsh planet around them seemed less intimidating now. The pain in her body faded into the background, and for a brief moment, she let herself believe that perhaps not all was lost. Vera didn't know what to make of this. A medic. In the middle of a war, it didn't make sense. But before she could think about it any longer, a sudden roar of explosions shattered the silence. The war was far from over. Jake quickly checked the sky. More of the Salthar's forces were closing in. They had to move, and fast. Jake's words rang in her ears. He was a medic, a human, trained to heal, not to fight. Yet there he was, ready to risk his life for hers, as if she were nothing more than another patient to save. He had no idea what kind of creature she was, or what her people were capable of. All he saw was a life in need of saving. And that was enough. The reality of her situation settled in. Vera had been given a second chance, a chance that no one, not even the fiercest warrior, could have expected. She looked at Jake once more, seeing him not as the enemy, but as the one who had saved her life. This human, with all his flaws and his courage, had become her unexpected hero. The battle around them was far from over, but for now, Vera had a new challenge. Understanding why she was still alive, and how this human could change everything she'd ever believed about the people she'd spent her life fighting. Vera's eyes flickered open, her senses returning slowly. The dull ache in her body was still there, but the unbearable pain from before had faded. She tried to move, but her limbs felt like they were made of lead, heavy and uncooperative. As she shifted, she realized she was no longer lying on the cold ground of the battlefield. Instead, she was in a small makeshift shelter, the soft hum of machinery filling the air. She could hear a faint peeping sound, and the rustle of fabric nearby. When she turned her head, she saw him. Jake, the human soldier who had saved her. He was sitting by a table, busy with medical tools, his back turned to her as he focused on preparing something. Vera's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. She should have been dead by now. Humans didn't help enemies. They killed them. Yet here she was, alive, tended to by the very person she had spent her life fighting against. Her breath caught as she looked at him more closely. His face was tired, lined with exhaustion, but his eyes were sharp, focused on the task at hand. He didn't seem to notice that she was awake yet. Vera wasn't sure what to do. Should she remain silent or confront him? She still couldn't wrap her mind around what had happened. In the midst of the war, in the heart of battle, he had chosen to save her. But why? What did he want from her? The question swirled in her mind, filling her thoughts with doubt. Humans were known for their ruthlessness, their endless thirst for war. But Jake, he was different. She couldn't deny it. The way he had treated her, with care and compassion, was unlike anything she had ever experienced. As she tried to sit up, she felt a wave of dizziness rush over her, and she collapsed back onto the bed. She winced, the familiar sting of pain returning as she pressed a hand to her side. Jake immediately turned around, his quick reflexes kicking in as he noticed her struggle. His eyes softened, but he didn't rush toward her. Instead, he took a few calm steps, assessing her condition. There was no panic in his movements, just a calm, steady determination. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and soothing, like he was talking to a child, yet his tone wasn't condescending. It was just caring. "You're still weak. You need to rest." Vera's eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't treating her like an enemy. He wasn't even treating her like an alien. To him, she was just another person, someone in need of help. It unsettled her, making her question everything she had known about humans. "Why are you doing this?" Vera finally asked, her voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. Her throat felt dry, and the words came out with difficulty. She could feel her pulse quicken as she waited for Jake's answer. Was this some sort of trap? Did he have plans to betray her once she was fully healed? It was a small, narrow space, just enough for them to hide from the prying eyes of enemy patrols. The soldier helped the child sit down, then quickly set about preparing what little supplies he had left. His movements were swift, and though he seemed calm on the outside, the tension in his shoulders betrayed his worry. He knew they didn't have much time. The child watched as the soldier worked. He couldn't help but feel a strange sense of gratitude. In the midst of all this destruction, in the chaos of war, the soldier had given him something he hadn't had in so long: hope. But as the soldier tended to his wounds, the child began to wonder. Why was this human soldier helping him? Was it out of compassion, or was there something else? Could the soldier have an agenda? The child didn't know, but he also knew that it didn't matter. In this moment, he had to trust the soldier. He had no other choice. As the soldier finished bandaging the child's injuries, he sat down beside him. The child looked at him, his eyes full of questions. The soldier met his gaze, his expression softening. "You're not alone anymore," the soldier said quietly, his voice low and steady. "I'm going to get you out of here. You're going to be okay." The child didn't respond. He couldn't. The words didn't make sense to him. How could he be okay when his entire world had been destroyed? How could he trust this human soldier when everything he had been taught told him that humans were enemies, that they couldn't be trusted? But as the soldier sat beside him, watching over him, the child felt something inside him shift. Maybe, just maybe, the soldier was right. Maybe in this broken world, there was a chance for something better. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a quiet moment of connection amidst the chaos. The child's breathing slowed, and for the first time since the attack, he felt the weight of his exhaustion. His eyelids grew heavy, and despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, he allowed himself to rest. The soldier remained awake, keeping watch. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult. They weren't safe yet, but for now, as the night fell around them, he allowed himself a moment of peace. In this broken world, with everything falling apart, he had found something worth fighting for, and he would make sure this child would survive, no matter the cost. The silence of the ruined building was deafening. The only sounds were the soft, uneven breaths of the alien child and the steady, rhythmic pace of the soldier's heart. The soldier's eyes never left the narrow gap in the debris where he kept watch for any signs of movement. His senses were on high alert, every creak of the building settling, making his muscles tense. He couldn't afford to relax, not even for a second. The child, resting beside him, was pale. His wound was severe, but the soldier had done his best to patch it up with the limited medical supplies he had. The bleeding had slowed, but the child's fever was rising. His tiny body was too weak to fight it off, and his breathing grew shallow with each passing minute. The soldier's mind raced, trying to come up with a solution, a way out, but the only thing that kept coming to mind was that they needed to move. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. The soldier gently shook the child's shoulder. "Hey, stay with me. We need to move." The child didn't respond. His eyes were closed, his face contorted in pain. The soldier's heart ached as he watched him struggle. He had seen soldiers die on the battlefield, but this was different. This was a child, an innocent life caught in the crossfire of a war that wasn't his fault. A loud, distant explosion shook the ground beneath them. The walls of the building creaked and groaned under the pressure, and the soldier's eyes darted toward the entrance. He could hear the sound of boots crunching on debris, the faint echo of enemy patrols nearby. They were close, too close. If they didn't leave now, they would be trapped. The soldier's hand clenched into a fist, his jaw set with determination. He would not let the child die here. Not today. He had promised him that he would survive, and he would do everything in his power to keep that promise. Kira didn't wait for him to respond. She turned on her heel and started walking, her pace quick and deliberate. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then followed. He knew better than to question her now. She had been right so far, and she clearly knew more about this world than he did. But he still couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into something dangerous. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the air grew thicker, the sounds more ominous. Ethan could feel the tension building. Every step felt heavier, like they were getting closer to something terrible. And then, without warning, they heard it. The sound of engines, low and rumbling, cutting through the quiet of the jungle. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that sound. It was the unmistakable sound of high-tech vehicles, machines built for destruction, and they were heading straight toward them. "They're here," Kira whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to move." Without waiting for Ethan to respond, she dashed toward the cover of some nearby trees. Ethan followed as quickly as he could, pushing through the thick underbrush. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to keep up with Kira. She was fast, so much faster than him, and she moved through the jungle as if she had been born here, as if she had never known anything else. The sound of the engines grew louder, closer, and Ethan could hear the occasional shout of alien voices. They were getting too close. Kira stopped suddenly, crouching behind a large tree. Ethan nearly crashed into her, but he managed to stop in time. He leaned against the tree, trying to catch his breath. But there was no time for rest. They were in danger now, and he knew it. "Stay quiet," Kira ordered, her voice sharp. "They can hear us if we make a sound." Ethan nodded, holding his breath as the vehicles passed by. He could hear the screech of metal on metal as they moved through the jungle, the sound of their engines drowning out the other noises of the world. He glanced at Kira, who was staring ahead with an intensity that made him feel like she could see through the trees. Her hand was on the hilt of a blade, ready for anything. As the vehicles passed, Ethan dared to breathe again. But he didn't feel relieved. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He was out of his element. He had no idea how to fight against these rival factions, and he had no idea who these people were, what they wanted, or how far they would go to get it. Kira didn't waste any time. She gestured for him to follow, and they began to move again, taking a different route. They didn't have the luxury of stopping to think. They had to keep moving, stay ahead of the enemy, and find a way to survive. The jungle seemed to close in around them as they traveled, the thick foliage offering little protection from the danger that lurked just beyond their sight. The further they went, the more the landscape seemed to change. It was as if the very earth itself was shifting under their feet, guiding them in a direction they couldn't yet understand. After what felt like hours, Kira stopped again. Ethan caught up with her, panting, his body weary from the constant movement. She was standing still, her eyes scanning the horizon. "This is it," Kira said softly. "We need to make our stand here." Ethan didn't ask any questions. He could see it in her eyes. The time had come. He wasn't sure how they would survive the next few hours, but one thing was certain. They had no choice but to face the rival faction head-on. As they prepared for whatever was to come, Ethan felt the bond between him and Kira grow stronger. They were no longer just two survivors lost in an alien world. They were a team, a force that was determined to survive. And if they were going to fight, they would fight together. The jungle was quiet once more, but Ethan knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. The rival faction was closing in, and the real battle was about to begin. The jungle was eerily silent as Ethan and Kira crouched behind the thick undergrowth, their breaths shallow and controlled. The rival faction had passed, but they knew it wasn't over yet. They had to move quickly, keep their distance, and stay hidden until they found a way to outsmart their enemies. But the air was thick with tension, and Ethan could sense something was about to change. Kira's eyes were focused ahead, her sharp instincts constantly scanning for any sign of danger. She had already taught him to be cautious, how to listen to the wind, how to read the signs around him. But despite all her training, Ethan could feel the uncertainty that lingered in the air. Something didn't feel right. "They're getting closer," Kira whispered, her voice tight with worry. We can't keep running. We need to confront them. Vera had always been trained to believe that humans were the enemy. They were the invaders, the ones who had brought war to her planet. They were ruthless, merciless, and had no place in the galaxy. Her entire existence had been shaped by this belief. From the day she was born, she had been taught that the human race was a threat to be eliminated, a force of destruction that had no regard for anyone other than themselves. But now, after everything that had happened, Vera found herself questioning everything she had ever known. Jake was a human, but he was nothing like the enemy she had been taught to fear. He had saved her life, taken care of her, and shown her a kindness that she had never expected. It was this kindness that created the internal struggle, the pull between her loyalty to her people and her growing connection to him. There were moments when she looked at him, and for a brief instant, she saw only a person, someone just like her, with hopes and fears, with a heart capable of compassion. But then the reality of her situation hit her again, and the battle began anew. She had to remind herself of who she was, of what she stood for. The humans had caused the destruction of her world, the deaths of her friends and family. Jake might seem different, but he was still one of them. She couldn't let herself be swayed by his actions, by the way he cared for her. She couldn't let him make her forget her duty. Her loyalty to her people came first, no matter what her heart wanted to believe. But the more time she spent with Jake, the harder it became to hold on to those beliefs. She had never seen a human act with so much empathy, so much courage. She had expected to see fear, distrust, and cold-hearted calculations, but instead, Jake showed her kindness without hesitation. The way he had treated her when she was at her weakest, the way he had risked his own life to save hers, it was more than she could have ever imagined from an enemy. And it created a confusion that Vera had never known before. The sound of the ships grew louder, and Vera couldn't ignore the fear that crept into her heart. Her people were close, but so was her choice. She could stay loyal to her race, to the war she had been born into, or she could abandon everything she had been taught and trust Jake, a human. The thought of betraying her people made her stomach turn, but at the same time, the idea of leaving Jake behind, of facing the reality that the kindness he had shown her could be a lie, was almost too much to bear. What if she trusted him, and it all turned out to be a mistake? What if he was just playing her, trying to get inside her head before his people killed her? The pain in her chest intensified. Every time she looked at Jake, she saw not an enemy, but a person who had cared for her when no one else had. She couldn't deny the feelings that had grown within her. Her body felt torn between two sides, her loyalty to her people and her heart's desire to believe that there was goodness in the human race. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape it. Jake, for his part, sensed the turmoil that Vera was experiencing. He could see the way she struggled to reconcile the person she had been trained to be with the person she was becoming. He could see it in her eyes, the confusion, the hurt, but he didn't know how to help her. He didn't know how to make her see that he wasn't the enemy. The weight of her indecision crushed him too. He didn't want to be the one who forced her to choose, but he knew that the choice was coming soon, and it would be a choice that could mean life or death for both of them. He wished that he could take her pain away, that he could show her a world where they didn't have to be enemies. But that was something beyond his control. The war was bigger than both of them. And yet he couldn't help but wish for an outcome that didn't involve fighting or death, a world where he and Vera could stand side by side and face whatever came together. It was a foolish wish, he knew, but in his heart he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still hope. Vera's mind was spinning. Every argument she had made in her own head felt like it was slowly unraveling. She had been trained to see humans as nothing but animals, monsters to be feared. But Jake had shown her otherwise. It wasn't just the way he had saved her, it was the way he had treated her as an equal, as a person. No human had ever done that before, and she couldn't deny that she had started to care for him. It terrified her. She could still hear the engines of the ships in the distance, the sound of her people growing closer. The battle was coming, And so was her decision. Would she fight for her people, for the race that had given her everything? Or would she betray them, risk it all, and trust the human who had shown her kindness? The ship's comms crackled, and Lyra's attention snapped back to reality. Lyra, the voice of their communications officer, Kira, came through. "We're approaching the base. It's time." Lyra nodded, taking a deep breath as she prepared for what was to come. The hardest part of their journey was over, but the true work of rebuilding would begin. As the fleet approached the rebel base, Lyra could see the green and blue planet below, the symbol of the hope they had fought so hard to preserve. It was their home now, the place where they could rebuild from the ashes of war. When the ship landed, Lyra was met by the rest of the rebels. They had all lost someone, but they had all found strength in each other. There was a sense of unity among them, a bond forged in the fires of battle. Together, they had defeated the most powerful force in the galaxy. Together, they had brought down the AI. But it wasn't just the victory that mattered. It was the redemption that came with it. The galaxy was no longer under the control of the AI, but it wasn't just the machines that had been defeated. It was also the oppressive system that had kept countless planets in chains for so long. The victory over the Council was a symbol of the strength of the human spirit, of the resilience that had carried them through every trial and tribulation. As Lyra stood before the gathered rebels, she saw their faces, filled with hope and determination. They had seen the horrors of war, the cost of their choices, but they had also witnessed the power of unity, the power of love, and the power of redemption. She couldn't help but feel proud of what they had accomplished, even though the road ahead was still uncertain. "I couldn't have done it without all of you," Lyra said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've lost so much, but we gained something far more important. We've shown the galaxy what humanity is capable of. And now, it's up to us to rebuild. We owe it to everyone we lost, to everyone who believed in this cause. We will create a new future, a future where the galaxy is free from the AI's tyranny." The rebels cheered, their voices rising in unison. There was still work to be done, still battles to fight, but for the first time in a long time, they could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The darkness that had consumed the galaxy for so long was beginning to recede, and in its place, a new dawn was rising. Lyra smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. It wasn't just the victory she felt, but the redemption of all the lives lost along the way. They had fought, and they had won. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. The battle was over. The galaxy was free. And together, they would rebuild. The future was theirs. Zorak's final words were lost to the vast emptiness of space, drowned out by the explosion of his flagship. His pride had led to his undoing, and in the end, it was humanity's strength, unity, and determination that had triumphed. As the dust settled, and the final remnants of the alien fleet were obliterated, the human fleet stood victorious. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The galaxy had been forced to acknowledge humanity's strength. But what would happen next? Would the aliens learn from this defeat, or would they seek revenge? The answers remained to be seen. But for now, humanity had proven that they were not the weak species the galaxy had once thought them to be. They had shown their true power, and no one would ever underestimate them again. The remaining forces of the Galactic Council, battered and bruised from the earlier clashes, had regrouped and entered Earth's orbit for one last stand. The space around Earth had become a war zone, with explosions lighting up the darkness of space. Debris from destroyed ships floated like confetti, evidence of the fierce battle that had unfolded. Humanity's fleet, although victorious so far, was far from unscathed, and both sides were pushing themselves to the limits in this climactic showdown. The sky was alive with chaos. Human warships, their hulls scorched from previous combat, maneuvered with deadly precision, locking onto alien targets. Plasma cannons fired in rapid succession, their glowing blue bolts streaking across space. Alien warships retaliated with their own powerful lasers, sending blasts of energy that ricocheted off the hulls of the human ships. The distant hum of engines mixed with the roar of explosions, creating a symphony of destruction as both sides fought to control the outcome. Amid the chaos, Commander Evelyn Rice stood at the helm of the flagship, her steely eyes fixed on the battle unfolding before her. She had seen many battles in her life, but none like this. This was more than just a war. This was humanity's final stand, their chance to show the galaxy who they really were. She clenched her fists, her focus unshakable. There was no turning back now. This battle would define the future of Earth and her people. As the fight raged on, the human fleet slowly began to gain the upper hand. Alien ships, once so confident and powerful, now struggled to keep up with the relentless offensive of humanity's fleet. The human forces were no longer just defending. They were attacking with a fury that had been building for years in secret. The aliens had underestimated them, and now they were paying the price. But even in the face of their losses, the aliens weren't going to give up without a fight. The remaining ships in the Galactic Council's fleet were determined to push through. Among them was Zorak's flagship, still intact, though battered from the earlier assault. The alien general had made it clear he wouldn't retreat, and he had one last trick up his sleeve. Reinforcements were on their way. Another wave of advanced ships that could turn the tide of battle in the Council's favor. Reyes knew that the battle wasn't over yet. She had one last obstacle to overcome, the final wave of alien reinforcements. If they didn't stop it, the Galactic Council would regroup and attack Earth once more. The fate of humanity was still in the balance. That's when Lieutenant Jackson, one of the bravest soldiers in the human fleet, stepped forward. He had been part of the operation from the very beginning, and he understood the stakes better than anyone. "Commander, give me a shot at their reinforcements," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos surrounding him. Reyes hesitated, knowing what it would cost. "Jackson, no, it's too dangerous. I know what's at stake. We end this now, or they'll come back stronger," Jackson replied. There was no fear in his eyes, only resolve. With a grim nod, Reyes gave him the go-ahead. Jackson and his team boarded one of the human assault ships, prepared to take on the alien reinforcements head-on. The ship rocketed toward the alien fleet, dodging plasma fire as it drew closer to the incoming ships. The alien fleet, unaware of the impending attack, was still regrouping when Jackson's team made their move. With expert precision, they launched a devastating assault, targeting key sections of the reinforcements. Explosions erupted as the alien ships took hit after hit. Jackson and his team fought like there was no tomorrow, knowing that their sacrifice would be the turning point in the battle. They disabled the alien ships one by one, buying time for the human fleet to focus on the remaining forces. But Jackson's ship took a heavy blow during the assault. The engines sputtered, and alarms blared as the vessel began to break apart. Jackson knew it was the end, but he didn't hesitate. He activated the ship's self-destruct mechanism, ensuring that the alien reinforcements would never reach Earth. Adrian and the others surged forward, taking advantage of the disarray. They moved like a well-oiled machine, darting between cover, firing at anything that moved. The Xantar soldiers attempted to regroup, but the damage had already been done. Without their commanding officer, they were losing their cohesion. Panic set in among the ranks. Adrian's heart pounded in his chest as he darted from one piece of debris to the next. He could hear the sound of Bonner's rifle firing in rapid succession, the soldiers' movements as fluid and practiced as a dancer's. It was an intense, chaotic dance of violence, one where the difference between life and death came down to the smallest of decisions. In the heat of the battle, Adrian's focus shifted to the Xantar girl in his arms. Her condition had worsened. Her breath came in shallow, painful gasps. He knew she wouldn't survive much longer unless they could get to the depot. They had to make it. "We're almost there," Adrian shouted to his team. "Push forward." But just as he spoke, a surge of Xantar reinforcements arrived, pouring into the street from the nearby buildings. The tide of battle was shifting again, and the humans were now outnumbered. Adrian's stomach churned as he realized their chances of survival were slipping through their fingers. "Bonner, we need a new plan," Adrian called out, his voice rising with urgency. Bonner didn't hesitate. "Retreat to the depot. We'll make our final stand there." Adrian nodded, pulling the Xanter girl closer. They had no other choice. The depot was their last hope. They broke from cover and ran, gunfire ripping through the air around them. The sound of enemy weapons charging and discharging was deafening, but they kept moving, forcing themselves toward the narrow path that would take them to the supply depot. Every step felt like an eternity, each footfall a reminder that they were running out of time. They had fought hard, but now the final test awaited them. It was do or die. As they reached the depot's gates, Adrian turned back for one last look at the battlefield. Their fight wasn't over yet, but they had made it this far. Now, it was time for the final stand. And this time, they would fight with everything they had. The depot gates slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud, a sound that echoed through the narrow corridors, marking the temporary end to the brutal fight outside. Adrian's heart raced in his chest, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps as the weight of their narrow escape began to sink in. The Xanter had almost overrun them. And yet, by sheer will and determination, they had made it to the safety of the depot, at least for the moment. But the fight was far from over. Inside the depot, the harsh, flickering lights cast long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, sweat, and blood, and the oppressive silence was deafening after the chaos they had just endured. Adrian could feel the weight of exhaustion bearing down on him. His muscles screamed in protest, his legs shaking as he leaned against a metal crate for support. The adrenaline from the battle was slowly wearing off, and the pain from the wounds he had sustained began to make itself known. But his focus remained sharp. "Get the supplies ready," Bonner barked, his voice hoarse but commanding. He moved quickly, checking their remaining ammunition and ensuring that the defensive systems of the depot were activated. There was no telling how long they could hold out. The Xanter might regroup and try again, and this time, they might not be so lucky. Adrian nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts were with the Xanter girl he had carried through the battle. She had barely survived, her pulse weak, her breathing shallow. He gently placed her on a makeshift bed, his hands trembling as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Her condition was dire, but there was still hope. The medical supplies in the depot could save her, but only if he acted fast. "Stay with me," Adrian whispered softly, as if his words could somehow reach her. He checked her injuries again, doing his best to stabilize her. The battle had been long, and the wounds she had sustained were severe. The Xanter were brutal, leaving no mercy for anyone who got in their way. Bonner walked over to him, his face set in grim determination. "How is she?" he asked, his tone betraying the concern he felt for the alien girl.